When I first played Detroit Become Human, one of my absolute favorite things was the graphics. Being a more graphics arts-oriented person, the graphics in Detroit Become Human really struck me just because of how realistic they looked. The appearance of human skin, the movement of eyes, the water on the roads and on cars, just everything looked so beautiful. And in this video, I wanted to take a look at the graphical engines that Quantic Dream used in order to achieve what they did in Detroit Become Human, and what exactly makes Detroit Become Human a technical masterpiece. Let's start off with some history of Quantic Dream's productions. First, there was Kara, a tech demo shown on March 7th, 2012 at the Game Developers Conference. This demo was released with intentions to demonstrate the capabilities of Quantic Dream's new game engine running real-time on the PS3. Kara, the android/robot in the video, was voiced by Valerie Curie, who also voices and acts Kara in Detroit Become Human. This tech demo received an award at the LA Shorts Fest and lots of praise from viewers. A year later, on March 21st of 2013, it was revealed that Quantic Dream was working on a new title for the PS4, though they didn't exactly reveal what the game was about except for it being character and story driven. It wasn't until October 2015 that Quantic Dream released a trailer for their new game, Detroit Become Human. Now, moving on to the actual production of Detroit Become Human, when it comes to the cost, programming, and collaboration that went into the game, the numbers themselves are quite impressive. The original script that David Cage wrote was between 2,000 and 3,000 pages long, and after help from writer Adam Williams, the choices, charts, and diagrams spanned around 5,000 to 6,000 pages of notes. The casting for the game included over 250 actors to play 513 roles, and performance capture took 324 days. The game has 35,000 camera shots and 74,000 unique animations. In an interview with Mammoth Gamers, Edwin Gaffney, an actor who plays as police officer Chris Miller in Detroit Become Human, talked about his experiences of getting hired and what his job was like. It took 5 auditions and 3 years to land a solid role. There were 3 separate parts to acting for Detroit Become Human: voice capture, which records just the voice of the character, motion capture, which records only movement, and then total performance capture, which records the actor's expressions, actions, and voice. Combining total performance capture with Cage's butterfly effect style of storytelling forced actors to reshoot similar scenes over and over again, just to change a couple of words at the end of a line in a scene. Another challenge was having actors rapidly switch emotions from one scene to another. Actors could go from aggressive, violent scenes to emotional tearjerkers in just a couple of minutes, something that would be rare in the film medium. In this sense, acting using motion capture, combined with the vetting process for becoming an actor on the Detroit Become Human project, enabled high standards in the acting of characters in the game. In addition to all of the attention paid to acting, lighting and rendering are some key areas that Quantic Dream seriously paid attention to in order to add a level of realism to the game. Cage mentioned in the PlayStation blog series that he didn't only want to work on perfect 3D modeling, but he also wanted to incorporate realistic lighting into the game.
Physical cameras, having virtual cameras that work pretty much the same way than real cameras. We worked on skin shaders, we worked on air shader, eyes shaders. We worked on translucency, which allows you to, when you have a strong light behind you here, see that your ear becomes red.
Quantic Dream had their very own 3D engine developed for Detroit Become Human, just as they have been demonstrating in the tech demo, Kara. The engine is optimized for the PS4 hardware, integrated to Maya for 3D assets. So, let me give you a brief perspective on how their graphics capabilities have evolved in terms of rendering and lighting. Early on, Heavy Rain, released in 2010 by Quantic Dream, used forward rendering. This is a basic form of rendering where every object in the scene are broken down to their pixels, given shading treatment, and then displayed to the screen. Objects that are not physically displayed on the screen will still be rendered, though those are often discarded by using special techniques that determine which objects are in the frame. Still, this can end up being inefficient and graphically costly, especially if many objects and lights are in the frame. Heavy Rain was also known for subpar eye movements and skin textures, as can be seen in some of these clips.
10 years old, that's not exactly grown up, but you're getting there.
This time you're done for. You're gonna pay for all your crimes, evil one.
Ha! Surrender, weakling!
However, Beyond Two Souls, released in 2013, uses deferred rendering instead of forward rendering. Put simply, geometry calculations are done first, and then shading is applied to every pixel. Looking at it more in depth though, it's a bit more advanced than forward rendering. Screen space depth, surface normals, diffuse color, and specular color of the vertices are stored into every pixel of an object, and after this information is examined and sent to a graphics buffer or G buffer where shading calculations are done, the shading is finally applied to each pixel. Objects that are not physically displayed on the screen will not be actually rendered, meaning that instead of object density in a given scene, the actual screen resolution is more of a limiting factor in terms of graphics capability. As a side note, deferred rendering cannot replicate transparency, such as in Windows and Water, because the G buffer cannot support it. With Detroit Become Human, Quantic Dream wanted to continue to improve their graphics. Their goals were to emphasize better graphics instead of better FPS, or frames per second. They wanted to avoid loading screens and include new features that would improve realism. Some of the new features they wanted to introduce were normals for shadows, multi-layered materials like skin and rain, as well as an eye shader. If they wanted to pack everything into a G buffer and deferred shading, though, they'd be way beyond their total number of render targets, and the different types of materials clashed with the deferred rendering system. So instead, they decided to just go back to forward shading like in Heavy Rain. The Detroit Become Human engine, instead of forward rendering, uses clustered forward rendering. Other games that use this style of rendering are Doom and Just Cause 3. With clustered forward rendering, the GPUs are more flexible and efficient because it divides the screen into sections, unlike in pure forward rendering, which calculates the entire screen at once and can be computationally expensive. Clustered forward rendering uses tiled rendering, meaning the screen is cut into tiles. A list of lights is filled for each tile, and each tile returns the depth of the lighting, stored as a Z variable, and the G buffer is only read once. For example, the Night of the Long Knives level includes 124 lights in this one scene, but by using clustered forward rendering, the graphical computational expense is seriously cut as compared to forward or deferred rendering. Another major innovation Detroit Become Human used in order to create such realistic scenes was by using something called temporal anti-aliasing. When the sampling rate, or the number of frames per second, is too low compared to the movement of objects on the screen, a blur can occur on the screen behind the object, referred to as aliasing. This can cause objects to appear to jump or create a trail behind itself. The goal of anti-aliasing is to remove these streaks. This can even be seen down to the pixels in something like pixel art, where anti-aliasing is a crucial part of creating quality art. However, standard anti-aliasing measures were not enough for Detroit Become Human, and Quantic Dream performed extra anti-aliasing by rejecting pixels of bleed streaks during motion blur sampling, as can be seen in this example image from the first scene in the game where Connor acts as the negotiator. Blur lines behind his armbanded cheek are hidden due to Quantic Dream's anti-aliasing measures. They also used blue noise instead of white noise for pixelation. Combined with temporal anti-aliasing, this did a great job to create smoother textures in the game. This can be seen in some images of the door of Alice's house at the beginning of the game. Quantic Dream also used improved subsurface scattering, using a 3D blue noise 128 by 128 by 8 pixel texture to scatter light more realistically. This creates an effect where Marcus's face, as an example, is lit more realistically due to the subsurface scattering of light under his skin. Another form of temporal anti-aliasing used was using grainy noise instead of sparse noise. You might ask, what does this even mean? Well, essentially, this smooths out the noise caused by light on the shadows, allowing a more smooth transition from shadows to light, as you can see in this example here from the beginning of the game during the negotiation scene. All of these efforts significantly improved the appearance of things like eyes, hair, and teeth on characters in the game. As David Cage mentioned in his interview, eyes use a special shader, and this, along with movement mapped from performance capture data of actors in motion capture, allows realistic eye movements of characters in-game. This is how characters have much more realistic looking eye movements than in games like Heavy Rain, which was notorious for the zombied eye look of its characters in the game. Interestingly enough, this is also put into practice in Detroit Become Human, where the deviants have much more realistic eye movements, while non-deviant androids have a dead, hollow look, kind of like Connor's early on in the game. There's also a sense of cinematography in Detroit Become Human. Often, the camera uses depth of field in order to distinguish the object or character in focus from the background and foreground. In case you don't know what depth of field is, it's basically a blur created by inefficiencies in the camera lens, and we tend to associate this blur with aesthetics and pretty bokeh effects in photography and film. This all is super evident in many of the scenes of the game. Detroit Become Human even uses film grain, caused by ISO, or International Organization for Standardization Or, okay, basically increasing graininess when taking pictures of dark areas and decreasing graininess or clarity when taking pictures of lighter areas. Because we tend to associate this effect with cinematography, whether consciously or unconsciously, this increases the cinematicness, if you will, of most scenes. And to add to the realism of the cinematography of the viewing camera of the player, sometimes the main character splashing in bodies of water while running will cast droplets on the screen, which you really have to give it to them for adding even that mechanic. The user interface is also quite impressive in Detroit. This game is probably one of my most favorite UI that represents the literal and figurative experience of Android's perspectives through the Mind Palace. Now, no matter how corny you find that name, it's the one made up by David Cage, I still think it's a rather impressive way to convey the android's vision. The lines and depth created in order to demonstrate how androids analyze situations, and the wireframe model of analyses of potential criminal activity by Connor are really creative ways to illustrate how an android might visualize the world. One of my favorite aspects of the game, which I know is hotly debated, is Quicktime events, or motion physical action reaction sequences as designated by David Cage back in 2010 for Heavy Rain. This is something I talk about more in depth in my upcoming book on game development. Check out my Twitter for more information. But back to the topic at hand. The reason I have so much respect for QuickTime events are because they genuinely cause you, the player, distress and anxiety. Many will complain about how simply missing one button will cause you to lose a main character unfairly. But to be fair, Detroit doesn't have many of those moments where just one missed press will cause death, and in fact that stress and tension is the beauty of QuickTime events. David Cage's entire point in the game is to immerse the player in the game and create an interactive cinema, quote unquote, and part of that interactivity is sharing the emotions of the character with the players. Yes, it might suck to lose your hard-earned character because of a couple of misclicks, but that demonstrates what it's truly like for people in these situations, whether they're a housemaid android living in an abusive household, or a super-engineered android working as part of the detective operations of a police force to negotiate in a hostage situation. Simply one wrong word or one wrong movement might mean the difference between life or death for these people. And giving players the ability to feel that just as well as a real person might is what makes QuickTime events, no matter how frustrating they are, pretty incredible. And add on top of the fact that these moments are experienced by androids who aren't supposed to feel emotions, and that adds a whole other level of meta to the game. So thank you for watching. I just want to reiterate that these opinions are mine, of course, and tell you that I'll create a follow-up to this video with a second part about the impressive narrative in Detroit Become Human, just because this game has impressed me so much. And I also briefly want to mention my book again. I'm currently working on interviewing and researching game developers, including those from Bethesda, Maxis, and Quantic Dream, in order to write a book about the experience of game developers in the industry. I'll soon be starting a Kickstarter to raise funds to publish my book, so please stay tuned for that, and find me on Twitter and subscribe to me on YouTube in order to keep up to date with those details. Thanks.